Enlightenment, luxury, reason, revolution. How should we define the 18th century? Some historians compare it to a great symphony, beginning quietly, almost elegantly, then gathering force until it ends in a tremendous crescendo. It's an apt image, for this was a century of sweeping change, when institutions that had seemed immovable, the monarchy, the church, the inherited social order, were increasingly subjected to the searching eye of reason. The intellectual foundations had been laid in the previous century. Scientific revolution had shown that nature could be observed, measured, classified, and explained. Enlightenment thinkers began applying the same confidence to human society. Why should governments exist? Where did kings derive their authority? What rights belong to ordinary people? Could education improve society? Could reason challenge tradition itself? Yet this was hardly an age of reason alone. It was a century of extraordinary contradictions, glittering palaces and desperate poverty, scientific inquiry and religious faith, rigid social hierarchies, and increasingly radical demands for liberty. At Versailles, monarchs still surrounded themselves with an almost theatrical display of power, and across Europe, aristocrats built elegant homes, collected paintings and antiquities, and cultivated lives of refinement. Yet beneath that polished surface, the old order was beginning to strain. Art gives us an extraordinary way of watching that transformation unfold. We begin in the world of Louis XIV, where painting, sculpture, architecture, and even garden design could be marshaled in the service of royal authority. Art was not merely decoration, it helped manufacture the image of absolute monarchy. From there, the mood changes. With the death of Louis, the grandeur of the Baroque gives way to the Rococo, a more intimate world of pastel colors, secluded gardens, silk dresses, flirtatious scenes, and aristocratic pleasure. But Europe was also looking backward. Wealthy travelers crossed the Alps on the Grand Tour, encountering the monuments of Rome and Greece. Increasingly, the newly excavated sites at Herculaneum and Pompeii. The ancient world was suddenly becoming immediate, no longer out of touch. And this encounter developed neoclassicism, an art of sharper outlines, restraint, civic virtue, and moral seriousness, a deliberate rejection of much that the Rococo had celebrated. And still the century had another turn to make. Artists and audiences became increasingly fascinated by experiences that reason could not easily contain. Storms and ruins and vast mountains, darkness and danger, the awe of absolute terror. By the century's end, these ideas were pushing Europe toward Romanticism. So the 18th century is not simply a sequence of styles. Baroque, Rococo, Neoclassicism, Classicism, and Romanticism. It is a century in which Europeans repeatedly considered what art was for. Art could glorify a king. It could create a private world of pleasure. It could display wealth, education, and taste. It could resurrect antiquity, teach civic virtue, hold a mirror up to society.
First, let's cover a few of the terms that we're going to see
overwhelm
throughout
the
this
viewer
lecture.
with wonder and fear.
The Enlightenment.
And behind all of it lies the central
here
tension
refers
of the
broadly to
century.
the 18th century
Civilization
Enlightenment,
confident enough to
where
believe that
it's
reason
an intellectual
could
movement
remake
that
the
placed
world,
emphasis on
and
reason,
restless enough
empirical
eventually to
observation,
try.
natural law, education, and criticism. Enlightenment thinkers did not all agree with one another, and many remained religious, but they shared a willingness to test inherited institutions and ideas rather than simply accept them because they were traditional. Historical painting was the most prestigious category in the academic hierarchy. It included subjects drawn from ancient history, the Bible, mythology, and allegory. These were considered elevated subjects because they could communicate moral and political ideas. The Academy, or the Académie Royale de Peinture et de Sculpture, was founded in Paris in 1648. and was the leading institution for artistic training and professional recognition in France. It helped establish standards of drawing, composition, subject matter, and artistic rank. The term fête galante refers to an elegant scene of courtship or aristocratic leisure, usually set in a garden or fantastical setting. The category became closely associated with the artist Antoine Watteau, whose Voyage to Kithra clearly highlights this sort of dreamlike landscape. The Grand Tour was an extended journey through Europe, especially through Greece, France, and Italy, undertaken by many wealthy Northern Europeans as part of their elite education. The term neoclassicism describes the renewed admiration for Greek and Roman art that intensified in the later 18th century and produced an aesthetic of clarity, restraint, and moral seriousness. The sublime. This refers to an aesthetic experience of overwhelming greatness, vastness, danger, terror, obscurity, overnatural power. That idea will become especially important as we move towards Romanticism. Before we get to the 18th century itself, it helps to remember the visual world inherited from the 17th century Baroque. Caravaggio's Calling of St. Matthew, painted around 1599 to 1600 for the Contarelli Chapel in Rome, gives us several of the features associated with Baroque painting. The lighting is abrupt and theatrical. A shaft of light crosses the room and helps direct our attention toward the moment of Matthew's calling. The figures appear close to our own space, almost as though the sacred event has erupted into an ordinary tavern. Caravaggio heightens the effect by dressing many of the figures in contemporary clothing, or at least his contemporary clothing, rather than creating a distant archaeological reconstruction. This intense contrast of light and dark is often called tenebrism. But the larger point is not simply technique. Baroque artists frequently sought immediacy. They wanted the viewer to feel present at the event. Across Catholic Europe, that emotional directness became especially useful in religious art associated with the Counter-Reformation, while in royal courts the same love of theatricality could be adapted to the display of political power. Baroque architecture and sculpture often work in the same way. Think of sweeping curves, dramatic movements, rich materials, ceiling paintings that appear to open into heaven, and ceremonial spaces designed to overwhelm the visitor. The style can be deeply spiritual, but it can also be political. That connection between theatrical display and authority is essential for understanding the court of Louis XIV. This portrait of Louis XIV was painted by Hyacinth Rigaud in 1701, when the king was 63 years old. This obvious example of idealism has become one of the most recognizable images of European absolutism. The painting was originally connected with a commission for Louis's grandson, Philip V of Spain. Louis admired the portrait so much that the original remained in France, and a version was sent to Spain. That alone tells us something about the power of the image. It was not simply a likeness, but a carefully constructed statement of kingship. Everything is calculated. Louis stands beneath a huge red and gold curtain, almost like an actor on a stage. He wears the blue coronation mantle, covered with the gold fleur-de-lis of the French monarchy, and lined with ermine. The sword, throne, column, and ceremonial textiles all reinforce his status. Even the king's enormous wig increases his visual height. And then there are the legs. Look at those legs. Louis had been an accomplished dancer in his youth, and the pose recalls the formal positions of court ballet. The exposed legs and high-heeled shoes presented an idealized body of command, even though the aging king was no longer physically the man represented here. Louis understood spectacle. At Versailles, court ritual, architecture, garden design, painting, sculpture, music, and ceremony all worked together in tandem. The king's authority was made visible through repeated performances. daily performances, the awakening ceremonies, the eating ceremonies. Versailles was therefore more than a palace. It was a political machine in which nobles competed for access to the monarch and participated in rituals that kept the royal person at the center of elite life. One of the key figures of the 18th century was Charles Lebrun. Lebrun stands at the intersection of art, royal administration, and institutional power. Lebrun was born in 1619 and became one of the most dominant artists of Louis XIV's reign. In 1664, he was named first painter to the king, and he eventually held major leadership roles within the Académie Royale. He was also closely connected with the Gobelins manufactory, which produced tapestries, furniture, and luxury objects for the crown. At the Palace of Versailles, Lebrun directed major decorative programs, including much of the imagery of the Hall of Mirrors, where Louis XIV's military and political achievements were transformed into an enormous visual celebration of monarchy. The Academy itself had been founded in 1648. It offered an alternative to the older guild system and increasingly became the institution through which ambitious painters and sculptors could gain prestige. Students learned drawing, especially drawing of the human figure, studied established masters, and competed for major honors. The Academy was sponsored by lectures and debates about artistic principles. Under royal patronage, artistic training became closely connected with the state. This is one reason Lebrun is important. He was not merely making paintings, he helped coordinate an entire system of good taste. The crown could use the Academy, royal building projects, the Gobelins, and official commissions to establish standards and project a consistent image of French magnificence. In that system, not every kind of subject was considered equal. The Academy developed a hierarchy that ranked some forms of painting as intellectually and morally superior to others. The academic hierarchy of genres gave painters a very clear ladder of prestige. At the top stood historical painting. In the 17th century, French writers such as André Félébillon articulated the idea that the most elevated painter was one who represented great actions drawn from history, or religion, or mythology. After historical painting came portraiture, then scenes of everyday life, and landscape, and finally still life. The hierarchy was based partly on what artists were believed to have to know. A history painter might need to understand ancient texts, scriptures, mythology, anatomy, costume, architecture, gesture, expression, and complex multi-figure composition. More importantly, a history painting could represent an exemplary action. It could show courage, sacrifice, faith, justice. That made it an intellectually ambitious in the eyes of the Academy. Portraiture ranked lower because the artist was thought to imitate a particular individual rather than an event or elevated narrative. Genre scenes rank lower still because they represented ordinary life. The Fête Galante, which we'll see, fits within this category. Landscape and still life could display enormous technical skill, but academic theory treated the imitation of trees and fruit vessels of flowers as less demanding than the representation of human action and moral choices. Of course, actual art markets did not always obey this hierarchy. Collectors eagerly purchased portraits, landscapes, still lifes, and intimate scenes. But the hierarchy mattered because it shaped artistic training, salon reputations, and the ambitions of artists. It also gives us a useful background for neoclassicism later in the century. Jacques-Louis David will revive the prestige of history painting by making ancient history a vehicle for moral judgment. The Rococo develops most strongly in France during the decades after the death of Louis XIV in 1715. With the old king gone, the political and social center of elite life became less tightly concentrated at Versailles. During the regency of Philip d'Orléans, many aristocrats returned to Paris, where fashionable private residences hotels particuliers encouraged a more intimate decorative style. The word Rococo is related to rocaille, the shell and rock ornament used in grottos and decorative interiors. Rococo decoration favors symmetry, curving forms, shells, foliage, decorative gilding, mirrors, pale colors, and surfaces that seem to dissolve into ornament. In painting, the same taste appears in softer colors, rapid brushwork, and sensual textures. It also includes amorous subjects, gardens, music, and theatrical play. One of the most distinctive Rococo subjects is the fête galante. The category is inseparable from Antoine Watteau. When Watteau was received into the French Academy in 1717, his work did not fit comfortably in the existing hierarchy. His reception piece, the painting we now call Pilgrimage to Cythera, showed elegant figures in an idealized landscape associated with love. The Academy effectively recognized a special category for this kind of subject. Watteau's example was followed by artists such as Jean-Baptiste Pater and Nicolas Lacret. Francois Bouchot would make Rococo imagery more openly sensual, while Jean-Honoré Fragonard later pushed the style toward dazzling movement and erotic play. So, Rococo is not simply Baroque but lighter. It grows from a different social setting: smaller interiors, elite private life, decorative luxury, and an art increasingly associated with intimacy and pleasure. Antoine Watteau's Signboard of Gerson, painted around 1720 to 1721, is one of the most fascinating paintings of the early 18th century because it shows the art market itself. Watteau made the work for Edme Francois Gerson, a Parisian dealer whose shop was located on the Pont Notre Dame. It was literally designed as a shop sign, although its extraordinary quality quickly lifted it far beyond ordinary commercial signage. The setting is an art dealer's interior. Paintings cover the walls. Customers inspect works, converse, negotiate, and compare. A dealer presents a picture to a fashionable woman. Other visitors lean over a counter to examine objects. Two older men appear to ogle the image of a beautiful young woman. Are they connoisseurs or simply dirty old men? Art is no longer shown in a palace or a church. Here, art is merchandise, it's conversation, it's fashion, and social distinction. There's a major development in the 18th century culture, and this is it. Paris supported a growing market for pictures, prints, and luxury goods. Collecting could become part of elite identity, but could also extend beyond direct royal patronage. Dealers, auction sales, collectors, critics, and public exhibitions increasingly shaped artistic life. The painting also stages a transition in taste. If you notice, on the left, workers pack a large royal portrait into a crate. That detail has often been read as a witty symbol of the passing of Louis XIV's age. Whether or not Watteau intended a complete political allegory, the contrast is still striking. The Sun King's monumental image is being boxed away, while fashionable customers fill the dealer's shop. The center of gravity has shifted from the singular body of the monarch toward a social world of looking, buying, and choosing. The fête galante can be translated roughly as a gallant entertainment or courtship party. Typically, small groups of fashionable men and women gather in a garden, or a wooded park, or otherwise imaginary pastoral location. They talk, flirt, play music, dance, or move in couples. Statues of Venus and Cupid may turn an apparently ordinary garden into a dream realm governed by love. These pictures are closely connected with theatrical culture. Watteau was fascinated by actors and by his commedia dell'arte tradition, and his figures often seem to be performing roles as much as living ordinary lives. Costumes, gestures, masks, and carefully staged encounters make social behavior itself look theatrical.
The landscapes are equally artificial. These are rarely documentary records of specific aristocratic picnics. They're dream spaces, assembled from parks and memories and stage scenery and usually the artist's imagination. The soft atmosphere blurs distinctions between reality and fantasy. But color is crucial. Rococo painters often use pale blues, pinks, creams, and silver grays, avoiding the heavier tonal drama associated with much of 17th century Baroque art. Brushwork can be loose and shimmering, especially in Watteau, so that silk, leaves, clouds, and flesh seem to dissolve into a unified atmosphere. The Fête Gallant therefore tells us a great deal about elite self image. It presents a world in which time can be devoted to conversation, to music, fashion, and desire. Labor is largely invisible. So are most of the economic and political structures that make this leisure possible. The result is not social reportage, but an idealized culture of refinement. And now we come to perhaps one of the most famous single images of the Rococo, Jean-Honoré Fragonard's The Swing, painted around 1767. In it, a young woman in a brilliant pink silk dress rises through a dense garden on a swing. Behind her, an older man, most likely her husband, controls the ropes. In front of her, half hidden in the foliage, a younger man looks upward toward her. The entire scene is provocative and arranged around movement, secrecy, and looking. A contemporary account of the commission describes an aristocratic patron who wanted an erotic image of his mistress on a swing. The painter, Gabriel Francois Doyon, reportedly declined the project and recommended Fragonard. Fragonard accepted, although he adjusted some of the details. The anecdote is useful because it reminds us that the painting was conceived as a private, playful, erotic commission rather than as a public moral statement. Visually, the work is astonishing. The woman's pink dress forms the brightest mass in the center. The ropes of the swing create strong diagonals. Her body is lifted into light, while the men occupy darker zones below. Flowers scatter beneath her. One slipper flies into the air, adding another little burst of motion, enticing the young lover, who is getting quite a view. When you think of it, this is quite the departure from the religious and historical paintings that preceded it. The garden is not calm nature. It is almost overgrown, theatrical, and dreamlike. Gardens like this don't typically exist. Statues emerge from the vegetation as well. There are cupids, leaves, fabric, flowers, and stones seem to participate in the same swirling motion. One of the cupids has a raised finger to his lips, suggesting, if you know the secret, don't tell others. Rococo painters excelled at making solid things appear weightless. Fragonard turned silk into motion, the garden into scenery, and flirtation into a visual game. The painting is decorative, but is also very carefully organized around desire. The swing becomes even more interesting when we examine the details. The young lover on the left is positioned low in the bushes, exactly where the swinging woman passes above him. His hat is raised into light, and his gaze makes the erotic joke unmistakable. The woman looks toward him as she kicks off her slipper. The older man on the right, who operates the swing, remains farther back and appears unaware of the full exchange taking place in front of him. The statues intensify the theme of secrecy. At the left is a sculpture of Cupid, with a finger raised to his lips, a gesture that can suggest silence. Cupid is therefore not simply decoration. He acts almost like an accomplice, presiding over a secret affair. Roses, traditionally associated with Venus and love, bloom through the garden. Compositionally, Fragonard gives us a triangle among the three figures. The swing itself repeatedly carries the woman between the two men. That makes motion part of the narrative. Her body literally oscillates between concealment and exposure. The viewer becomes implicated as well. We're not looking at an open public event. We're voyeurs, peering into an enclosed garden filled with shadows, foliage, hidden sight lines, and partial knowledge. The pleasure of the painting depends on seeing what one character apparently does not. This is one reason the Rococo became vulnerable to criticism later in the century. To admirers, a work like The Swing offered wit, sensuality, technical brilliance, and sophisticated play. To critics, the same features could be condemned as frivolous, private, and morally unserious. Fragonard turns that tension in the painting's entire subject for pleasure for its own sake. Antoine Watteau's Pilgrimage to Cythera was his reception piece for the French Academy in 1717, and it helped define the Fête Galante as a distinctive kind of painting category. Cythera is the island associated in classical tradition with Aphrodite, or Venus, the goddess of love. Watteau transforms that mythological association into an elegant modern fantasy. Well-dressed couples gather in a hazy landscape beneath the statue of Venus. Cupids hover through the air. At the left, a richly decorated boat waits to carry the figures away. One of the painting's great puzzles is whether the figures are arriving on Cythera or leaving it. The traditional title suggests a pilgrimage toward the island, but the movement of the figures seems to lead toward the boat, as if the visit is ending. That ambiguity matters because Watteau's paintings often contain a note of melancholy beneath their elegance. Look at the couples. They seem somewhat dressed in theatrical garb. They don't all seem to be performing the same sorts of actions. Some sit close together, others rise reluctantly, others move toward departure. The painting can almost be read as a sequence of stages in love, attraction, intimacy, attachment, and separation. Watteau's technique reinforces the mood. The paint is soft and atmospheric. Forms melt into the landscape. The figures are small compared with the expanse of the trees and the sky, the distant water. Nothing feels fixed. Even the moment itself seems temporary. That feeling quality distinguishes Watteau from the more overt erotic comedy of Fragonard. The world is beautiful, but it's also passing away. Love, pleasure, theater, and youth are all temporary. In that sense, the Fête Galante can be both luxurious and surprisingly wistful. If we look closely, the details of Pilgrimage to Cythera make the landscape itself participate in this theme of love. Near the right stands a statue of Venus decorated with flowers. Cupid figures appear throughout the scene, and little winged putii rise into the air above the departing group. The classical goddess is not presented as a subject of a formal mythological drama. Instead, her presence quietly transforms the entire setting into an island governed by attraction and desire. The couples are arranged almost like a visual progression. Closest to Venus, one pair remains seated and absorbed in one another. Nearby, another couple begin to stand. Farther to the left, figures have already joined the procession toward the boat. Watteau links these groups with a continuous serpentine movement through the landscape. Notice also how difficult it is to separate people from setting. Costumes echo the warm tones of the earth. Trees and clouds dissolve into soft brushwork. The golden light gives the scene the character of memory rather than everyday observation. The boat at the left is especially extravagant. It is not a practical ferry. It belongs to the fantasy. It's ornamented and surrounded by cupids. The journey therefore feels less geographic than it does a dream. Watteau was deeply interested in theater, and that matters. The figures behave as if they are both aristocrats and performers. Their gestures are elegant, restrained, and slightly artificial. We never get a single dramatic climax. Instead, the painting presents a chain of social poses.
The rest is a world suspended between classical mythology and contemporary fashion, between theater and dream. And now we come to portraiture, with Francois Boucher's Toilette of Venus, painted in 1751 for Madame de Pompadour, one of the most important patrons of the French Rococo. The subject is classical: Venus, the goddess of love, attended by cupids. But Boucher treats antiquity very differently from the later neoclassicists. His goal is not archaeological seriousness. The classical subject becomes a framework for sensuality, for luxury, and decorative innovation. Venus is surrounded by shimmering fabrics, pearls, flowers, doves, and soft flesh. Boucher's surfaces are deliberately seductive. Silk looks cool and slippery. Skin appears luminous. The palette is dominated by pale blues and pinks, creams and pearl whites. The entire composition seems designed to appeal to touch as much to sight. The painting was made for Pompadour's Chateau de Bellevue, and its connection to her is especially appropriate. Pompadour had performed in court theatricals, including in roles associated with Venus, and she cultivated an image of refinement, taste, and artistic sophistication. Boucher was one of the most successful artists of Louis XV's reign. He worked across painting, tapestry design, decorative arts, and stage-related imagery, and in 1765 he became the first painter to the king. His art was enormously fashionable, but it also attracted criticism. Denis Diderot, writing about the Paris salons, attacked Boucher's artificiality and sensuality, seeing his work as symptomatic of moral corruption. That criticism helps explain the changing climate of taste. What made Boucher appealing to Rococo patrons, sensual services, erotic mythology, decorative fantasy, would become precisely what later critics wanted to reject. Madame de Pompadour was born Jeanne Antoinette Poisson in 1721. She became the official mistress, or maîtresse en titre, of Louis XV in 1745 and received the title Marquise de Pompadour. Her importance goes far beyond the stereotype of a royal mistress. Pompadour was a sophisticated cultural patron. She collected paintings and prints, commissioned artists, participated in court dramas, supported architects and craftsmen, and helped shape the visual culture of Louis XV's court. Francois Boucher became especially closely associated with her patronage and produced portraits and decorative works that helped define her public image. Pompadour also supported the luxury arts. She was closely connected with the development of French porcelain at Vincennes and Sèvres, where brilliant colors, delicate forms, gilding, and painted decoration turned porcelain into a major expression of courtly taste. Her portraits are carefully constructed. She's often shown not simply as beautiful, but as cultivated, surrounded by books, music, drawings, and objects that advertise intellectual and artistic refinement. In other words, patronage became part of her identity. The relationship between Pompadour and Boucher also shows how taste is produced. Rococo was not just the spontaneous invention of artists. It was sustained by people with money, access, houses to decorate, social ambitions, and networks of craftsmen and dealers. Pompadour sadly died in 1764, only 42 years old, but her name remained inseparable from the decorative culture of the mid-18th century France. When later critics attacked Rococo luxury, they were also attacking the court society and systems of patronage that had made that luxury possible. Comparing Baroque and Rococo is useful because the two styles can share mythological subjects while creating very different effects. Baroque painting often emphasizes weight, dramatic lighting, strong diagonals, and emotional intensity. In artists such as Rubens, bodies have real mass, flesh is abundant, drapery twists and surges. Mythological scenes can feel monumental or energetic, even when the subject is sensual. Rococo artists inherit many Baroque interests: movement, color, theatricality, sensuality, but scale them to a more intimate world. Forms become lighter, colors become paler, compositions often feel airy rather than monumental. Gold, porcelain, silk, mirror, flowers, and ornaments replace the heavier grandeur of 17th century court display. The architectural setting also changes. The mature Baroque is often associated with churches or royal chapels, grand staircases, ceremonial halls, and urban spaces designed to impress crowds. Rococo decoration, in contrast, flourishes in private apartments and salons, where ornament can wrap around walls and doors and mirrors, ceilings. This distinction is not absolute. Styles overlap, and artists do not suddenly stop painting in one manner when another becomes fashionable. But the social emphasis changes. Baroque spectacle often communicates authority, religious, dynastic, or institutional. Rococo spectacle more often communicates refinement, intimacy, sociability, and pleasure. That difference becomes especially important later in the century, when critics begin to equate the Rococo with the perceived decadence of the aristocratic society of its age. Neoclassicism will keep the elegance of elite art but strip away much of the curl, softness, and erotic play. The Grand Tour was one of the most important cultural institutions of elite 18th century Europe. The phrase is commonly associated with Richard Lascelles, whose Voyage of Italy was published in 1670. By the 18th century, the journey had become a kind of finishing education for wealthy Northern Europeans, especially young British aristocrats. A traveler might spend months or even years abroad, often accompanied by a tutor, governor, or knowledgeable guide, sometimes jokingly referred to as a bear leader. The route varied, but Paris was a major stop, followed by travel across the Alps into Italy, Turin, Milan, Florence, Rome, Naples, and Venice. Rome was usually the intellectual center because it offered ancient ruins, the Renaissance and Baroque masterpieces, churches, collections, and a large community of artists, dealers, guides, and antiquarians. The goal was partially educational. A young aristocrat was expected to learn languages, manners, the history of the place, classical literature, art, and architecture. But the Grand Tour was also social. Travelers met diplomats, aristocrats, artists, and other Europeans of similar rank. It could function as networking, cultural training, and controlled adventure all at once. Women participated too, although social conventions and travel conditions made the Grand Tour more strongly associated with elite men. To commemorate their time abroad, travelers bought things. They commissioned portraits, purchased paintings and prints, collected ancient sculpture, gems, bronzes, plaster casts, books, and decorative objects. The Grand Tour therefore helped create an international market in which the experience of antiquity could literally be brought home. It also opened up a black market for looters and counterfeiters willing to make a quick buck off of ignorant and unsuspecting aristocrats. Travel in the 18th century was often presented as a form of education rather than simple recreation. Writers had been giving advice about travel long before the classic age of the Grand Tour. Francis Bacon's essay of travel, first published in the early 17th century, recommends that young travelers keep journals, learn the language, observe courts and institutions, visit churches and monuments, and seek knowledgeable local contacts. Much of that advice still sounds surprisingly modern. The ideal traveler was supposed to do more than look. He was expected to compare. How did governments differ? How were cities planned? What did different ancient buildings reveal about Roman society? What could Italian painting teach about color, composition, or taste? Travelers also relied on guides and ciceroni, local experts who explained monuments and collections. The term cicerone, derived from Cicero, became a common word for an erudite guide. Rome offered a particularly intense education because the ancient city was visible everywhere in fragments. The Colosseum, the Pantheon, triumphal arches, aqueducts, columns, sculptural collections, and newly excavated sites allowed classical texts to be compared with physical remains. But the Grand Tour was never purely scholarly. Young travelers gambled, attended theaters, went to masquerades, socialized, collected, and sometimes behaved very badly. That tension between education and pleasure is part of the institution of the Grand Tour. A useful way to think about it is as cultural credentialing. A traveler returned home not only with objects, but with stories and knowledge, with portraits and the claim of first hand experience. To say, I have seen Rome, carried social authority. Johann Joachim Winckelmann is one of the central intellectual figures behind the 18th century revival of classical taste. Born in 1717 in Prussia, Winckelmann came from a relatively modest background, but became one of Europe's most influential writers on ancient art. He moved to Rome in the 1750s, where he gained access to major antiquities collections and became deeply involved in the study of Greek and Roman sculpture. In his Reflections on the Imitation of Greek Works in Painting and Sculpture, published in 1755, Winckelmann praised Greek art for what he famously described as noble simplicity and quiet grandeur. He believed the greatest Greek works combined ideal beauty and emotional restraint. His History of the Art of Antiquity, published in 1764, was even more influential. Instead of treating ancient objects as isolated curiosities, Winckelmann tried to organize Greek art historically, describing periods of development, maturity, and decline. That attempt to construct a systematic history of style is one reason why he's often called the founder of modern art history. Winckelmann's ideas were not always archaeologically accurate. Many sculptures known to him were Roman copies rather than Greek originals, and his idealization of Greek whiteness ignored the fact that ancient sculpture and architecture were often painted. But his influence was still enormous. For artists and patrons, antiquity became more than a source of decorative motifs. It became a moral and aesthetic standard. Greek art, in Winckelmann's interpretation, represented discipline, balance, ideal form, and self control. Those qualities would become fundamental to the movement known as Neoclassicism. The 18th century witnessed one of the most dramatic archaeological developments in European cultural history, the excavation of the buried cities around Mount Vesuvius. Systematic Bourbon-sponsored excavations began at the site of Herculaneum in 1738 and at Pompeii in 1748. The two sites had been buried by the eruption of Vesuvius in 79 CE, but their conditions of preservation were vastly different. Herculaneum lay under deep volcanic material, while Pompeii was covered more extensively by ash and lapilli. Excavation methods in the 18th century were often closer to treasure hunting than modern archaeology, but the discoveries were sensational. Visitors could now encounter ancient houses, wall paintings, mosaics, streets, shops, and theaters. Antiquity suddenly became much more intimate. People could see how ancient Romans outside of Rome decorated their dining rooms and their gardens, their bedrooms. The discoveries circulated through publications as well. The lavish volumes of La Antiquità de Herculano Apposte, issued from 1757 onward, reproduced wall paintings, ornaments, bronzes, and other finds. These images spread classical motifs across Europe. The impact on design was enormous. Architects and painters, furniture makers, ceramicists, and interior decorators borrowed motifs from excavated antiquity. The so-called Pompeian taste helped shift classical revival away from the heavy grandeur of 17th century Rome toward lighter, more archaeological forms. For Grand Tour travelers, Pompeii and Herculaneum offered something extraordinary.
the possibility of walking through an ancient city, rather than merely reading about it from one of their books. Charles Townley represents the collecting side of the Grand Tour. Townley was born in 1737 into a wealthy English Catholic family and made several extended visits to Italy beginning in the 1760s. There he developed a major collection of ancient sculpture, working with dealers, excavators, restorers, and antiquarians. By the time he returned to Britain, his London house had become famous for its display of classical antiquities. Johann Zoffany's painting Charles Townley in his sculpture gallery, painted around 1782, turns the collection into a portrait of intellectual identity. Townley sits among the ancient marbles, while learned friends examine books and sculpture. The room is densely packed with objects. Antiquity surrounds the collector physically and socially. Many 18th century ancient sculptures were heavily restored. Missing noses, arms, hands, or attributes might be reconstructed so that a fragmentary ancient object could be displayed as a visually complete statue. The distinction between ancient material and modern restoration was often much less strict than it is in museums today. Collecting was also entangled with the economics of excavation and export. Antiquities moved from Italy into private collections across Britain and Northern Europe, sometimes through carefully documented purchases, and sometimes through practices modern archaeology would find deeply problematic. After Townley's death in 1805, the British Museum purchased a large portion of his collection. His grand tour and acquisitions therefore became part of the National Museum. The image of Townley surrounded by sculpture captures a major 18th century idea. Knowledge, taste, ownership, and classical culture could reinforce one another. Grand Tour souvenirs were part memory, part education, and part status symbol. A traveler who had spent months in Italy might return with an entire visual archive. Prints by Giovanni Battista Piranesi provided dramatic views of Roman ruins. Paintings by Canaletto offered precise and luminous views of Venice. Artists such as Giovanni Paolo Panini produced architectural capricci, imaginary arrangements of famous monuments that condensed the experience of Rome into a singular, spectacular composition. Portraiture was another major souvenir. Pompeo Battoni became famous for painting grand tourists in elegant clothing, often with classical sculpture. These portraits functioned almost like 18th century proof of travel. The sitter is not merely wealthy, but educated and connected with antiquity. Travelers also collected carved gems, miniature bronzes, plaster casts, such as the one you're looking at here, coins, books, and antiquities. Some purchased genuine ancient material, and others bought modern reproductions, but both could carry cultural value. Manufacturers recognized the market. Josiah Wedgwood, for example, built a major business around ceramics that translated classical motifs into fashionable modern objects. The famous Portland vase, an ancient Roman cameo glass vessel, inspired Wedgwood's jasperware reproduction experiments. So the souvenir was not trivial. It helped transform travel into a permanent identity. A country house filled with classical sculpture, Roman views, imported furniture, and Italian paintings could announce that the owner had encountered the sources of European culture firsthand. This flood of objects also helped make classical forms more familiar. Antiquity moved from distant ruins into modern rooms, and that familiarity prepared the ground for neoclassical taste. By the middle and later 18th century, Rococo art was increasingly criticized as artificial, luxurious, and morally weak. That criticism should not be simplified into a sudden replacement of one style by another. Rococo and neoclassicism overlapped for decades, and many patrons enjoyed both. But the cultural climate was changing. Writers associated with the Enlightenment
increasingly asked whether art should serve a public purpose. Denis Diderot's Salon criticism is a good example. Diderot could admire technical skill while attacking what he considered empty sensuality. He was especially harsh toward Francois Boucher, whose erotic mythologies seemed to him disconnected from moral seriousness. At the same time, archaeological discoveries and new scholarship made ancient art more visible and more prestigious. Winckelmann's praise of Greek restraint gave classicism a moral language. The excavations at Herculaneum and Pompeii provided a growing vocabulary of ancient forms. Grand Tour travelers returned home eager to decorate buildings and collections in a classical manner. Politics also mattered. 18th century discussions of civic virtue, republican history, sacrifice, and citizenship made ancient Rome especially useful as a source for examples. In France, those themes became increasingly charged as the monarchy faced financial and political crisis in the 1780s. Neoclassicism therefore offered more than a new look. It promised seriousness, clear composition, antique subjects, austere interiors, and disciplined bodies could be associated with reason, self-control, and moral purpose. The contrast with the swing could hardly be stronger. Fragonard gives us secrecy and private pleasure. Neoclassicism increasingly gives us public action, sacrifice, and the claim that art should instruct as well as delight. Neoclassical painting has a recognizable visual vocabulary. First, it tends to favor clarity. Figures are usually sharply outlined rather than dissolved into soft, atmospheric brushwork. Spaces are often shallow and stage-like, allowing the action to read almost like a sculptural relief. Second, compositions tend to emphasize order. Horizontal and vertical lines, architectural divisions, symmetry, and carefully balanced figure groups create a sense of control and order, while decorative excess is reduced. Third, color is often more restrained than in Rococo painting. Reds, whites, blacks, and earth tones can tend to dominate. Surfaces are smooth, and brushwork is often suppressed so that the viewer can concentrate on form and narrative. Fourth, the ancient world becomes a major source for artists. Painters use Greek and Roman dress, architecture, sculpture, and stories, and some of these details reflect serious antiquarian study. But neoclassical paintings are still imaginative reconstructions rather than archaeological documents. Most importantly, classical subject matter often carries an ethical weight. Artists choose moments of self-sacrifice, stoic endurance, republican virtue, or loyalty to the state. This is why the phrase return to antiquity is not enough to define this movement. Earlier artists had used classical mythology constantly. Boucher's Venus is a good example. What changes is the use made of antiquity. In Rococo painting, Venus can authorize sensual pleasure. But in neoclassicism, Roman and Greek history becomes a storehouse of moral examples. The formal style and the moral message reinforce one another. Straight lines look disciplined, clear spaces look rational, and restrained gestures look like control. Often considered the founder of the neoclassical movement, Jacques-Louis David was born in Paris in 1748 and became the dominant French history painter of the late 18th century. His early career was shaped by the academic system. He competed repeatedly for the prestigious Prix de Rome and finally won it in 1774. The prize allowed him to study in Rome from 1775 to 1780. That experience transformed his art. In Italy, David studied ancient sculpture, Roman architecture, Renaissance painting, and 17th century masters. He filled sketchbooks with objects and figures and architectural details. Over time, his style became harder, more severe.
After returning to Paris, David achieved major success at the Salon. His paintings were technically accomplished, large in scale, and built around morally charged moments from antiquity. David's political career later became extraordinary. During the French Revolution, he aligned himself with the Jacobins, served as a deputy in the National Convention, voted for the execution of Louis XVI, organized revolutionary festivals, and painted images of revolutionary martyrs such as the death of Marat. After the revolution, he became closely associated with Napoleon, who had freed him from prison, and produced major images of the imperial regime. Following the Bourbon Restoration, he went into exile in Brussels, where he died in 1825. But before all of that political history, the paintings of the 1780s had already established his visual language. Ancient subjects, severe compositions, controlled emotion, and moral conflict. Two works are especially important for us. The Oath of the Horatii, painted in 1784, and The Death of Socrates of 1787. Both take ancient stories and transform them into arguments about duty to the state, principles, and the disciplined body. David painted The Oath of the Horatii in 1784 while working in Rome. The painting was a royal commission connected with the administration of Louis XVI, and it was exhibited at the Paris Salon in 1785, where it attracted enormous attention. The story concerns a legendary conflict between Rome and its neighboring city of Alba Longa. According to Roman tradition, rather than allowing the two armies to fight a full battle, each city chose 3 champions. Rome selected the 3 Horatii brothers. Alba Longa selected the 3 Curiatii brothers. David picks the moment when the Horatii swear themselves to combat before their father, who holds their swords aloft. Interestingly, this exact oath scene is not described in the surviving ancient text. David invents the visual moment, drawing on the broader legend and possibly on later dramatic treatments. The composition, however, is clear. The 3 brothers occupy the left arch. The father stands in the center, beneath the middle arch. The grieving women and children occupy the right. The architecture divides the moral world into distinct zones. The men are built from straight lines and hard angles. Their arms extend toward their swords. Their legs are planted firmly. They act collectively, almost as a single machine of duty. The women, in contrast, collapse into curves. Their sorrow represents the human cost of the oath, because the families are connected by marriage and betrothal across enemy lines. David turns a complicated legend into a single moral confrontation: public duty versus private attachment. The emotional structure of the Oath of the Horatii becomes even clearer when we separate the 2 halves of the painting. On the left, the brothers are active. Their bodies are upright, muscular, and angular. Their arms repeat one another in a coordinated gesture. The father is also erect and controlled, his raised swords forming the visual and symbolic center of the composition. On the right, the women form a soft, descending group. Their bodies fold inward. They don't participate in the oath. They anticipate its consequences. The family relationships make the conflict tragic. Sabina, traditionally identified among the women, is connected with both sides. She is the sister of the Curiatii and married to one of the Horiatii. Camilla, another Roman woman in the story, is betrothed to one of the Curiatii. Victory for Rome, therefore, cannot be enormously simple. Someone they love is likely to die. David emphasizes this contrast through line. Straight, taut, outward thrusting forms define the men. Curves, drooping heads, and inward gestures define the women. The gender coding is unmistakable. Male bodies become symbols of civic action. Female bodies, symbols of domestic grief. That structure reflects 18th century assumptions about gender as much as ancient Rome. The painting represents public virtue as masculine and private feeling as feminine. It is also worth remembering that the work predates the French Revolution. It was not originally painted as direct revolutionary propaganda. Later viewers, however, found it easy to connect its language of oath, sacrifice, and citizenship with revolutionary ideas. That afterlife is part of its power. David created an image general enough to outlive its original commission and specific enough to make moral choice visually unforgettable. David's Death of Socrates, painted in 1787, turns from Roman patriotism to Greek philosophy. Socrates was condemned to death in Athens in 399 BCE on charges of impiety and corrupting the city's youth. Plato's dialogues preserve different aspects of his trial and final days. In the Phaedo, Socrates spends his last few hours discussing the immortality of the soul with his followers before drinking hemlock. David deftly selects the moment just before the fatal act. Socrates reaches for the cup without even looking at it. His other hand is raised as he continues to speak. The gesture makes the point perfectly. The body is about to die, but the philosophical argument continues. Socrates was around 70 years old, yet David gives him an idealized, muscular body. This is not documentary realism. The physical strength visualizes moral and intellectual strength. Around him, the disciples react emotionally. Some turn away, some cover their faces. The man handing the cup cannot bear to look directly at Socrates. By contrast, Socrates, who has accepted his fate, his civic duty, remains composed. At the foot of the bed sits Plato, shown as an elderly man lost in thought. Historically, Plato would have been much younger at the time of Socrates' death, and according to the Phaedo, he was not present because he was ill. David deliberately manipulates history to create a symbolic image of philosophical memory. The painting therefore combines an ancient source with artistic invention. Like Oath of the Horatii, it is less concerned with reconstructing one literal instant than with constructing an ideal of conduct and moral turpitude. The details of David's Death of Socrates reinforce its theme of service to the state. Socrates is the most illuminated figure in the painting. His pale body and white drapery stand out against the muted architecture and darker clothing around him. The light does not come with Baroque supernatural drama. Instead, it makes Socrates visually legible at the center of intellectual control. His raised finger has often been read as an emblem of continued teaching and of his philosophical concern with realities beyond the body. At the same time, his other hand reaches calmly toward the cup. He does not even need to look at death in order to accept it. The chain lying on the floor refers to his imprisonment, but it's already been removed from his body. The physical restraint is gone. What remains is the voluntary act of choosing principle over escape. The figures around him provide a catalog of grief. One disciple clutches Socrates' leg. Another turns away. The cupbearer extends the poison with a downcast face. Plato sits apart, abandoned in thought. These emotional responses make Socrates' composure even more striking. The moral structure resembles Oath of the Horatii. Emotion's not absence, it's displaced onto surrounding figures so that the central hero can embody self-control. This is the neoclassical idea at its most concentrated. Ancient history becomes ethical drama. The painting asks us to admire someone who values truth above survival. Placed beside Fragonard's Swing, the contrast is extraordinary. One work turns freedom into erotic play. The other turns freedom into the ability to choose principle even in the face of death. Another major movement during the 18th century is something called the Sublime. The Sublime introduces a very different kind of aesthetic. In 1757, Edmund Burke published a philosophical inquiry into the origin of our ideas of the sublime. Burke made a sharp distinction between beauty and sublimity. Beauty was associated with qualities that attract and please: smoothness, delicacy, proportion, softness. The sublime came from experiences that overwhelm us. Burke connected the sublime with terror, darkness, obscurity, vastness, power, and danger, provided that danger is encountered from a position of relative safety. A storm at sea is terrifying if we're inside it, but viewed from a distance, it can produce an exhilarating mixture of fear and admiration. In Fisherman at Sea, dated to 1796, J.M.W. Turner captures the sublime by placing fragile human figures within a vast, threatening natural world. The fisherman's small boat is dwarfed by dark waves, jagged rocks, and an immense moonlit sea, emphasizing both the beauty and the terrifying power of nature. The sublime complicates the Enlightenment. The 18th century is often described as an age of reason, yet thinkers were equally interested in the limits of reason and in powerful bodily sensation. What happens when the mind confronts something too vast to measure and too powerful to control? That question becomes central to Romanticism. In the 19th century, artists such as Turner, Caspar Friedrich, and Gary Cole will repeatedly place human beings before forces larger than themselves. So the sublime is not simply another style, it's sort of a theory of response, an attempt to explain why fear, danger, and uncertainty can become sources of aesthetic pleasure. Caspar Friedrich's Wanderer Above the Sea of Fog, painted around 1818, belongs to the 19th century, but it provides an excellent preview of both Romanticism and the sublime. A solitary man stands on a rocky outcrop with his back to us. Before him stretches a landscape of fog, peaks, and uncertain distance. We cannot see his face, so we cannot read a specific emotion. Instead, we're invited to occupy his position. This back-turned figure is commonly referred to in the German as Rückenfigur, literally a back figure. And Friedrich uses this device repeatedly. It creates a strange relationship between the viewer and the subject. We look at the figure, but we also look with him. The landscape is not a simple topographical record. Friedrich often combined studies of different rock formations, mountains, and natural features into carefully constructed compositions. The scene therefore feels believable but also inward and symbolic. The man appears elevated and commanding because he stands above the fog. At the same time, he's tiny compared with the immensity around him. That tension is essential. Is he the master of the landscape, or has the landscape revealed how small he is? The fog prevents complete knowledge. Peaks emerge and disappear. Distance becomes immeasurable. We see enough to be drawn forward, but not enough to resolve the space. That's where the sublime enters. Nature is beautiful, but it's also unknowable and larger than the individual. The painting shifts the focus away from court society, academic hierarchy, and civic duty toward subjective experience. By the early 19th century, the solitary individual confronting nature will become one of the defining images of Romantic art. Looking back across our brief Odyssey, we can see that the 18th century repeatedly changes the answer to the question, what is art for? Under Louis XIV, art participates in the machinery of monarchy. Rigaud's portrait, Versailles, royal ceremony, and institutions such as the Academy turn visual culture into a language of authority. The Academy also tries to regulate artistic value. History painting stands at the top because it can represent elevated actions and moral examples. That hierarchy remains important even when actual collectors purchase a much wider range of subjects. After 1715, Rococo art develops a very different language. Watteau gives us gardens and theater and courtship and ambiguity. Boucher transforms mythology into sensual luxury. Fragonard turns an aristocratic garden into a brilliantly organized game of secrecy and desire. The Grand Tour then makes the ancient world newly accessible. Travelers see Rome, visit excavations, buy antiquities, commission portraits, and bring classical taste home with them. Winckelmann gives that taste an intellectual theory, while Pompeii and Herculaneum supply new archaeological material. Neoclassicism turns those discoveries toward moral history. In David, antiquity becomes a theater of civic duty and philosophical principle. The Horatii choose public obligation over private attachment. Socrates chooses truth over life. And the sublime opens yet another path. Instead of social polish and rational order, it asks what happens when the individual confronts forces too vast, dangerous, and mysterious to control. The arc, from royal spectacle to aristocratic pleasure to classical morality, finally to romantic subjectivity, does not describe every 18th century artwork, but it does reveal how dramatically the values attached to art could shift within a single century.